In the dense, forgotten folds of the Mexican jungle, where the borders of San Luis Potosí and Veracruz blur into a single suffocating green, lies a place that officially does not exist. It is a wound in the landscape, a zone of unnatural silence, accessible only to those who know the unmarked paths, or to the satellites that once hunted it from the cold vacuum of space. Here, the air itself feels heavy, thick with humidity and the weight of unspoken history, a place where the barrier between civilization and absolute savagery was not just crossed, but systematically erased. Out of this primal wilderness, an alien structure emerges. It is not a ruin in the romantic sense, but the skeletal remains of a brutalist nightmare. Reinforced concrete, stained dark by years of relentless rain, juts through the canopy at impossible angles. Oxidized steel rebar curls from shattered walls like exposed ribs, while the jungle works tirelessly to digest the compound, its vines and roots prying into every crack, slowly pulling the monument back into the earth from which it was violently carved. The soundscape is a deep, layered chorus of life, yet it is the profound absence of the human that defines it. The drone of insects is a constant, a high-frequency hum that vibrates in the bones. The rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth is a reminder that this territory has been reclaimed. But the dominant sound is the wind, whistling through empty corridors and across decaying rooftops, carrying with it the smell of wet soil, rotting wood, and the faint metallic tang of decay. This was never a mansion built for comfort or display. Its architecture speaks a different language, one of control, paranoia, and tactical dominance. The walls are fortress-thick, designed to repel an invasion. The few remaining windows are narrow slits, firing positions more than sources of light. Every line and angle was conceived not for aesthetic pleasure, but for strategic advantage, blending into the landscape as a predator does, waiting in perfect, camouflaged stillness. The compound is a silent protagonist in a story that has already ended. It does not speak, but it remembers. Memory is etched into its very fabric, in the pockmarks on a concrete wall that suggest a firefight, in the deep gouges on a steel door that hint at a desperate attempt to enter or to escape. It was once an extension of a singular, terrifying will, a body built to house a monstrous ambition. Now it is a corpse, its purpose extinguished, left to testify through its own decomposition. Even in its decrepitude, the logic of its design is clear. The outer perimeter, now breached and overgrown, was once a series of deadly layers. One can still trace the ghost of an electrified fence, its metallic posts leaning like tired soldiers. A collapsed watchtower, half swallowed by a kiba tree, once offered a 360-degree field of fire. This was not a home to be protected. It was a cage designed to keep the world out, and a master of that world securely inside. Among the debris, one feature commands a chilling focus: a series of immense steel cages. Their bars, thick as a human arm, are scaled for something far larger and more powerful than any native fauna. They are rusted now, their doors hanging agape, groaning softly as the breeze pushes them. They are utterly, profoundly empty, and this emptiness is more menacing than any presence could ever be. These were not enclosures for animals, they were thrones for apex predators, symbols of a power that held life and death in its grasp. The psychological gravity of these structures is immense. They stand as monuments to a particular kind of sadism, a need not just to defeat an enemy, but to dominate them at a primal biological level. They are a physical manifestation of a worldview that saw other humans as prey. Now, as the jungle's green tendrils wrap around their bars, they seem like relics of a fallen religion, the altars of a faith built on terror, their terrible god long since vanished. To step inside the main building is to enter a tomb. The interiors have been stripped of everything valuable, but the space itself tells a story. The corridors are long, low-ceilinged, and deliberately disorienting, designed to confuse and intimidate intruders. There are no grand foyers or opulent living spaces, only a labyrinth of functional, windowless rooms where the air is stale and cool, trapped for years. The atmosphere is one of claustrophobic authority, a place where sunlight and mercy were forbidden entry. This was the heart of an empire, a covert nerve center from which a campaign of terror was waged across a nation. Within these decaying walls, fates were decided, orders were given, and strategies of unimaginable cruelty were conceived. The very geometry of the compound, its hidden chambers, its reinforced bunkers, its isolated position, was engineered to nurture and amplify the darkest aspects of human nature, far from the eyes of the state or the constraints of any moral law. The fortress was built to conceal. Its primary luxury was its invisibility, its ultimate power, its isolation. But the secret it guarded was more than just the logistical operations of a criminal enterprise. It was a philosophy of violence, a self-contained universe with its own brutal physics. The structure was a physical argument that absolute power, when pursued relentlessly, must inevitably retreat from the world and build its own hell. What it truly protected was an idea that a man could become a law unto himself, a sovereign of his own dark kingdom. The concrete, the steel, the cages, they were all just tools to enforce this single, terrifying proposition. The compound was a mirror, reflecting the internal architecture of the man who built it. A fortress of paranoia, impenetrable from the outside, but ultimately a prison for the mind that conceived it. Luxury was just the surface. What happened inside few dared to know. To understand the story of the man who built this kingdom of fear, subscribe and join us as we descend into the heart of the empire. The man who would build a kingdom in the jungle was not born into the narco-aristocracy. He was a product of the very institution created to destroy it. Heriberto Lazcano emerged not from a dynasty of smugglers, but from the anonymous, disciplined ranks of the Mexican army. His story begins not with privilege, but with the stark realities of rural poverty in the state of Hidalgo, a world where the paths to advancement were few, and the allure of a uniform offered a rare promise of order, purpose, and escape from the cyclical deprivations of civilian life. His choice to enlist was less an act of patriotism than a flight from chaos. The world outside the barracks was one of ambiguity, weakness, and inefficiency, a society he would come to view with a deep and abiding contempt. The military, by contrast, offered a clear hierarchy, a rigid code of conduct, and a tangible sense of power. It was a self-contained universe where strength was rewarded, loyalty was absolute, and violence was a sanctioned professional tool. This was the logic that first appealed to him, a brutalist philosophy he would later perfect. Within the army, Lazcano was not just another soldier, he was an asset to be sharpened. His aptitude for discipline and his capacity for enduring extreme hardship marked him for a different path. He was selected for the Grupo Aeromóvil de Fuerzas Especiales, or GAFE, an elite special forces unit trained by the world's foremost counter-terrorism experts. Here, he was systematically deconstructed as a man and rebuilt as a weapon of the state, an instrument designed to hunt and neutralize its enemies with maximum efficiency. The training was a descent into a specialized form of inhumanity. GAFE operators were taught to think like their targets, to master the arts of ambush, interrogation, and psychological warfare. They learned to operate in the shadows, to become ghosts in hostile territory, and to view the world as a tactical map of threats and opportunities. The state itself provided him with the curriculum for his future empire, teaching him that fear was the most effective instrument of control, and that overwhelming force was the only true arbiter of conflict. This elite conditioning created a profound psychological fracture. The line between serving the law and embodying a more potent, more absolute form of power began to dissolve. Deployed to combat the burgeoning drug cartels, Lazcano and his GAFE comrades witnessed a different kind of authority, one that was wealthier, more decisive, and seemingly more effective than the state they served. They saw that the cartels operated with a clarity of purpose that the government, with its bureaucracy and compromises, could never match. The moment of desertion was not a singular act of betrayal, but the logical conclusion of his training. A rival power, the Gulf Cartel, recognized the value of these state-forged weapons and made an offer. They did not want common thugs, they wanted a disciplined, professional army. For Lazcano, this was not a fall from grace, but a promotion. It was a chance to apply his elite skills in an arena with unlimited resources and no rules of engagement, a purely meritocratic system where his talent for violence would be unshackled. With this defection, a new entity was born into the criminal underworld, Los Zetas. They were not just enforcers, they were a paradigm shift. Lazcano and the other former GAFs brought military doctrine to the chaotic world of drug trafficking. They organized themselves not as a gang, but as a paramilitary unit with a clear chain of command, sophisticated intelligence operations, and a cold, strategic approach to violence that stunned their more traditional rivals. Their first acts were not simple murders, they were tactical operations. They moved with coordinated precision, using superior firepower and communications to hunt and eliminate rivals. The violence was no longer about passion or revenge. It was a calculated instrument for territorial acquisition. Every execution, every kidnapping was a message, a demonstration of a new and terrifyingly efficient order that was asserting its dominance over the old ways of the narco trade. The core of this new order was Lazcano's own evolving worldview, a profound and visceral contempt for weakness in all its forms. He despised the flamboyant, publicity-seeking capos of the old cartels as much as he despised the corrupt and ineffectual state he had abandoned. His ambition was not merely to be rich or powerful, but to build an organization that was a perfect reflection of his ideals, disciplined, impenetrable, and absolutely ruthless. This vision of a pure and uncompromising organization required a physical heart, a nerve center that embodied its core principles. The gaudy mansions of traditional drug lords were anathema to him. They were monuments to vulnerability, invitations for attack. What he began to envision was not a home but a fortress. It would be a place shielded from the corrupting influence of the outside world, a sanctuary where his new order could be forged in isolation. The idea of the compound was thus born not from a desire for comfort, but from a deep psychological and strategic necessity. It was the architectural manifestation of his paranoia, a physical response to the constant threat of betrayal and attack. He needed a space that was invisible, self-sufficient, and utterly defensible, a black site from which he could project power without ever being seen, a tangible expression of his own ghost-like presence. The search for a location was a hunt for nothingness. He sought a void on the map, a place where the reach of the state was weakest, and the natural environment provided the ultimate camouflage. The dense, remote jungles where the borders of San Luis Potosí and Veracruz dissolved into an impassable green offered the perfect canvas. Here, he could carve out a sovereign territory, a kingdom hidden from the prying eyes of satellites and informants. The structure he imagined was an extension of his own internal architecture. It would be hard, functional, and devoid of sentiment. Reinforced concrete would serve as its skin, a shell to protect the operational brain within. Its luxury would not be measured in marble or gold, but in its impenetrability, its advanced communications, and its capacity to insulate its inhabitants from the world they sought to dominate. This was the genesis of the obsession. The compound was to be more than a hideout. It was to be a laboratory for a new kind of power. It needed to be a place for training his soldiers, for planning his campaigns, for interrogating his enemies, and for housing the apex predators that he saw as a reflection of his own nature. The fortress was the necessary vessel for his predatory ideology. The first sketches were not drawn by an architect, but by a military strategist. Every wall was a defensive position, every corridor a potential kill zone, every building placed according to fields of fire and surveillance coverage. The design was a testament to his belief that survival depended on total control of one's environment, a principle learned in the GAF and now to be applied on an imperial scale. Therefore, when the first foundations were laid in the suffocating humidity of the jungle, it was not merely the start of a construction project. It was the physical act of secession from the known world. It was the beginning of a monument to paranoia, a concrete declaration that a man could build his own nation, governed by its own brutal laws, hidden deep within the heart of another. The construction began not with an architect's blueprint, but with a soldier's tactical map. The initial structure was skeletal, a brutalist core of reinforced concrete and steel I-beams sunk deep into the humid earth, designed for a single purpose, to serve as a secure staging ground. In these early days, as the armed wing of the Gulf Cartel, Los Zetas were a tool, and their jungle outpost was merely a workshop, functional, severe, and utterly devoid of comfort. It was a physical manifestation of their role, a hardened instrument of someone else's will. As their operations proved lethally effective, the flow of capital increased, and with it the need for greater autonomy. The first expansion was not vertical, but horizontal. A new wing was added, its purpose strictly operational. This was not a space for living, but for planning, storage, and training. The architecture mirrored the organization's evolving identity. The walls grew thicker, the corridors more labyrinthine, the entire structure beginning to turn inward, creating a self-contained world governed by its own unforgiving logic. The compound's growth was a direct chronicle of the Zeta's criminal diversification. When extortion and kidnapping became central pillars of their enterprise, new rooms were constructed deep within the main building. These spaces were windowless, soundproofed, and equipped with industrial drains in the concrete floors. They were clinical, sterile environments designed for the systematic dismantling of human resistance. The fortress was developing specialized organs, each dedicated to a specific function in its predatory metabolism. This new phase of construction was financed by a river of cash that defied traditional laundering methods. Bales of currency arrived in armored trucks, their passage cleared by a network of corrupted officials. The labor was sourced locally, a workforce of men who understood that silence was not a choice, but a condition of survival. They poured the concrete and welded the steel, becoming unwitting collaborators in the creation of a monument to their own subjugation. The definitive break from the Gulf Cartel around 2010 was the catalyst for the compound's most significant transformation. It was no longer an outpost. It had to become a capital, the sovereign heart of a new and independent empire. This strategic shift demanded an invulnerable nerve center. Deep beneath the main building, a space was excavated, shielded from seismic sensors, satellite surveillance, and electronic eavesdropping by layers of earth, concrete, and steel mesh. This subterranean chamber was the compound's brain. From here, using encrypted satellite links and military-grade communication arrays, Heriberto Lazcano could coordinate operations across a dozen states. He could listen to intercepted radio calls from the army, direct the movement of Sicario convoys hundreds of miles away, and issue execution orders with the push of a button. The jungle fortress was now a black site from which a ghost commander waged a national war. With sovereignty came enemies on all fronts. The logic of paranoia became the chief architect. The compound's perimeter was re-engineered into a layered killing field, an outer fence. Woven with razor wire and carrying a lethal electrical charge was the first line of defense. Beyond it, a network of motion sensors and pressure plates was buried, each connected to a central command post that monitored the surrounding jungle as if it were a living organism. Closer to the main buildings, camouflaged machine gun nests were carved into the earth, their fields of fire calculated to interlock and create inescapable zones of death. Collapsible watchtowers, designed to retract into the canopy, were manned by snipers equipped with night vision scopes and 50-caliber rifles capable of disabling an armored vehicle. The compound was no longer just a fortress. It was a self-digesting organism designed to consume any threat that breached its skin. This escalation in defensive measures was mirrored by the hardening of the structure itself. The few existing windows were replaced with ballistic glass several inches thick, their frames reinforced with steel plates. Underground tunnels were dug, connecting key buildings and leading to hidden escape routes deep in the jungle. The compound was becoming a testament to Lazcano's core belief. The world was an irredeemably hostile place, and survival depended on achieving a state of total, impenetrable isolation. But the most profound architectural statement was yet to come, an addition that served no strategic military purpose. Massive steel cages, their foundations poured deep into the bedrock, began to rise near the compound's center. The bars were forged from industrial-grade rebar, thick as a man's arm, and the locking mechanisms were engineered to contain immense force. These were not enclosures for livestock or guard dogs. They were built to house apex predators. The arrival of the first tigers coincided with the peak of Lazcano's reputation as El Verdugo, the executioner. The animals were more than exotic pets. They were a living symbol of his ideology. They were pure, immoral predators who killed without malice or hesitation, Embodying the cold efficiency he sought to instill in his own organization. They were a mirror, reflecting the nature of the man who fed them. The presence of these creatures transformed the compound's psychological atmosphere. Their roars would echo through the jungle at night, a primal sound that served as a constant reminder of the power that resided at the heart of this fortress. The cages were a throne room for his predatory ego, a clear and visceral message to both allies and enemies about the kind of force they were dealing with. As the Empire's logistical reach became transnational, a final, crucial addition was made. A clearing was carved out of the jungle, and a reinforced concrete helipad was poured. This feature shattered the compound's isolation, transforming it from a remote hideout into a central nexus of a global criminal network. It was a portal through which cocaine flowed north, weapons flowed south, and Lazcano himself could appear or disappear at will. The image of a sleek, modern helicopter descending into this brutalist sanctuary in the heart of the wilderness was the ultimate expression of his power. It represented the fusion of primal savagery and sophisticated technology that defined Los Zetas. The helipad was a concrete declaration that no corner of the continent was too remote, no jungle too thick to be beyond the reach of his will. Every expansion was a chapter in his ascent. The initial concrete shell was the story of a soldier for hire. The fortified perimeter was the paranoid manifesto of a king at war. The communications bunker was the constitution of a new state. The helipad was the emblem of a global CEO. The fortress had become a material biography, its layers of construction a physical timeline of an empire built on fear. Yet deep within this functional nightmare, a single, secret contradiction was hidden. Behind a false wall in his private quarters lay a room that defied the compound's brutalist ethos. It was a space of pure conventional luxury, its floors made of polished black marble, its walls lined with exotic wood. This was not a war room or a cell, but a private audience chamber, a hidden throne room for a man who publicly disdained such displays. This secret chamber was a concession to a different kind of power, the quiet, opulent authority of the old-world capos he claimed to despise. It was evidence that even within the mind of the cold military strategist, a more traditional vanity still resided. It was a space where the logic of the fortress was suspended, if only for a moment, in favor of the timeless language of wealth. The structure was therefore complete, a perfect map of its creator's psyche. It was a war machine, a bunker, a prison, and a palace, all fused into one monstrous whole. The raw concrete spoke of his ruthlessness, the security systems of his paranoia, the cages of his predatory soul, and the hidden marble of an ego that, despite everything, still craved a throne. The compound was more than a headquarters. It was the physical embodiment of his philosophy. It was an argument, made in steel and stone, that absolute power required the creation of a separate reality, a self-contained universe insulated from the moral and legal frameworks of the outside world. Here, in the green heart of the jungle, he had not built a house, but a new planet. This process of construction was, in itself, an act of psychological warfare. The rumors of the impenetrable fortress, the man-eating tigers, and the subterranean chambers spread through the underworld, becoming a key part of his legend. The compound projected power even when it was unseen, its very existence a deterrent, a silent testament to a force that operated beyond all known limits. Which detail best reveals the builder's vanity? The marble ballroom, the bulletproof windows, or the underground vault? At the zenith of his power, the fortress was no longer a project in progress, but a living, breathing organism. It was a fully realized kingdom of concrete and fear, its systems humming with a lethal efficiency. The generators provided a constant, low-frequency thrum that became the compound's heartbeat, while the silent, disciplined patrols of Zetas moved along its perimeter like white blood cells in a hardened artery. The jungle that once threatened to consume it was now held at bay, a manicured green wall that served as the first layer of a meticulously engineered isolation. Life within this sovereign territory was governed by a rhythm that was neither civilian nor purely military, but a monstrous hybrid of the two. Days were not marked by the sun, which barely penetrated the canopy and the narrow windows, but by shifts in operational tempo. The quiet of the morning could be shattered by the sudden arrival of a helicopter, its blades whipping the humid air into a frenzy, delivering cash, weapons, or a high-value captive. The nights were punctuated by the roars from the steel cages, a primal sound that reminded every inhabitant of the ultimate law of this place. The subterranean command center was the Empire's cerebral cortex. Here, in the cold recycled air, the world was reduced to data points on glowing screens. Encrypted communications arrays linked this jungle tomb to operatives in every major city, while intercepted radio frequencies from the military and police painted a real-time map of the enemy's movements. It was a space devoid of emotion, where decisions resulting in dozens of deaths were made, with the clinical detachment of a logistics manager optimizing a supply chain. From this bunker, Heriberto Lazcano reigned not as a king on a throne, but as a ghost in the machine. He was a disembodied will. His presence felt hundreds of miles away through a command relayed by satellite, his face rarely seen even by his own regional commanders. He had achieved the ultimate state of a modern warlord, a panopticon from which he could see everything, while remaining completely invisible himself, a predator whose power was magnified by his own absence. This operational intensity was insulated by a grotesque parody of tranquility. The compound itself was kept immaculately clean, the concrete swept, the weapons polished. In the central courtyard between the barracks and the main building, there were moments of profound silence, broken only by the chirping of insects. This quiet was not peaceful. It was the tense stillness of a predator's lair between hunts, an atmosphere of coiled potential energy where any sudden movement could trigger an explosion of violence. When outsiders were brought into the compound, their arrival was a carefully choreographed act of psychological warfare. Blindfolded and disoriented after a long journey, they would be led through the labyrinthine corridors, the sounds and smells of the place, the faint scent of bleach, the metallic tang of the cages, the oppressive humidity working on their senses before they ever saw their host. The fortress was designed to dismantle a person's will long before they reached the center of power. Deep within his private quarters, behind a seamless, electronically locked panel, lay the compound's greatest contradiction, the hidden audience chamber. Here, the brutalist functionality gave way to an almost theatrical opulence. Polished black marble floors reflected the soft light from concealed fixtures, and walls of dark, exotic wood absorbed all sound. A single, massive table and a set of heavy leather chairs were the only furniture. This was not a war room. It was a stage. The gatherings held in this secret chamber were not celebrations, but inquisitions disguised as meetings. Lieutenants and allies summoned to the fortress would sit at this table under the silent, unblinking gaze of Lazcano. He would speak little, allowing the weight of the room, the isolation of the fortress, and his own reputation to extract the truth. Loyalty was not sworn here. It was tested, often to the breaking point, in an atmosphere of suffocating paranoia. The surveillance was total and reflexive. Hidden cameras, their lenses no bigger than a pinhead, were embedded not just in the public corridors, but within this secret room itself. Every guest, every guard, every subordinate was under constant observation. The system was a reflection of a mind that trusted nothing and no one, a paranoia so profound that it consumed its own enforcers. The watchers were themselves being watched, creating an endless feedback loop of suspicion. Within this sealed ecosystem, fear was the primary currency and the only truly reliable bond. Communication was sparse and utilitarian. Orders were given and obeyed without question. The penalty for failure or perceived betrayal was absolute and often spectacular. The entire social structure of the compound was built not on loyalty, but on the shared intimate knowledge of the consequences of disloyalty. The tigers were the high priests of this religion of fear. No longer mere symbols, they were now an active, breathing part of the compound's machinery of control. Their massive forms, pacing restlessly behind the thick steel bars, were a constant, living spectacle of predatory power. They were fed on a strict schedule, their meals often consisting of whole carcasses of cattle, a display of the resources at the compound's disposal. The ritual of feeding was often a public event within the compound, a mandatory spectacle for new recruits or visiting subordinates. The sight of the massive carnivores tearing into flesh and bone served as a visceral and unforgettable lesson in the natural order of this new world. It was a demonstration that stripped away all pretense of civilization, reducing existence to the simple, brutal binary of predator and prey. Whispers that the tigers served another, darker purpose became a powerful instrument of control. It was never confirmed, but the rumor that disgraced enemies or traitors were fed to the animals was allowed to flourish. The absence of a body, the impossibility of a grave, was a form of psychological terror that resonated far beyond the compound's walls. It was the ultimate expression of power, not just to kill an enemy but to erase them from existence. The fortress had successfully seceded from the outside world, creating its own reality, governed by its own brutal physics. The laws of Mexico, the norms of society, the strictures of morality, all of it ceased to exist at the electrified perimeter fence. Inside was a sovereign nation of one, where the will of its creator was the only constitution, and the roar of a tiger was the only hymn. This absolute control, however, came at the cost of absolute confinement. As his empire expanded, Lazcano's own world shrank. He was the master of a dozen states, yet he could not walk the streets of any of them. The fortress that projected his power across a continent simultaneously held him prisoner. Every layer of security designed to keep his enemies out also served to lock him in. The psychological effect of this self-imposed incarceration was profound. With no external frame of reference, his worldview became a closed circuit. His paranoia, with no new data to contradict it, fed upon itself, growing more intense and more insular. The man in the bunker began to trust only the stark, simple logic of the predators in the cages, for they, like him, were trapped by their own nature. The helipad was the compound's only real door to the outside world, a concrete portal that allowed for the illusion of freedom. But Lazcano's departures were rare, and his arrivals were swift and secretive. He moved like a phantom, never staying in one place for long but always returning to the gravitational pull of his fortress, the only place where the variables of the outside world could be completely controlled. The small population of cooks, cleaners, and technicians who serviced the compound lived as ghosts. Recruited from remote villages and bound by threats against their families, they moved through the fortress with downcast eyes, their existence tolerated as long as they remained invisible and silent. They were the silent, terrified subjects of this miniature kingdom, their lives entirely subject to the whims of a man they rarely saw. The compound was the antithesis of a home. It offered no warmth, no rest, no sense of belonging. It was a machine for survival and dominance, and its inhabitants, including its master, were merely components within it. Every space was designed for a function: command, confinement, defense, execution, leaving no room for the unscripted needs of human life. In its completed state, the fortress took on the chilling quality of a mausoleum built for a man who was still very much alive. It was a monument to a concluded history, a concrete sarcophagus designed to protect its occupant from a death that he courted every single day. The invincibility it projected was the invincibility of the dead, perfectly safe, perfectly isolated, and perfectly inert. At the height of his reign, from the depths of his jungle fortress, Heriberto Lazcano must have believed he had created the perfect system. The architecture was flawless, the technology was state-of-the-art, and the protocols were ruthlessly enforced. He had built a world without weakness, a machine that could not fail. But the great flaw in his design was not in the thickness of the concrete or the voltage of the fences. It was in the one element he could never fully control, the unpredictable, unquenchable human need for the world outside the cage. The perfect prison he had constructed for his power was about to be undone not by a frontal assault, but by a simple human impulse. The perfection of a closed system is its greatest vulnerability. Within the jungle fortress, the machinery of terror had been refined to a state of frictionless efficiency, a world without variables. But an empire is not built of concrete and steel alone. It is an organism of human will, and will is subject to ambition, envy, and fatigue. The first crack in Heriberto Lazcano's kingdom was not a physical breach, but a subtle, internal dissonance, a shift in the violent rhythm he had so carefully orchestrated. This dissonance had a name, Miguel Ángel Trevino Morales, known as Z40, where Lazcano was the calculating strategist, a ghost who ruled through doctrine and distance. Trevino was a creature of pure, visceral sadism. His violence was not a tool for control, but an end in itself, a chaotic and public spectacle that began to deviate from the cold military logic upon which the Zetas were founded. The organization was developing two heads, one that planned and one that devoured, and they were beginning to turn on each other. The whispers of this internal friction were faint at first, carried on encrypted channels and in the nervous glances of lieutenants summoned to the fortress. Trevino's operations were becoming more reckless, his cruelty more performative, attracting a level of attention that Lazcano, the master of invisibility, had always disdained. The disciplined paramilitary unit was beginning to show signs of devolving into the very thing its founder despised, a gang driven by the raw egos of its most brutal members. Simultaneously, the world outside the electrified perimeter was changing. The Mexican state, long a fragmented and often complicit adversary, had produced a new and formidable enemy. The Special Intelligence Unit of the Mexican Navy, CIMAR, was not like the local police or the Federal Army. They were a scalpel, not a sledgehammer, trained by international partners and operating with a singular, uncorrupted focus to dismantle the Zeta leadership, starting with its head. Their hunt was not a series of frontal assaults, but a slow, methodical strangulation. They did not attack the fortress, they studied its shadow. Their weapons were signals intelligence, satellite imagery, and a patient network of informants cultivated through a combination of pressure and protection. The silent, orbiting eyes in the sky that Lazcano had sought to evade were now being tasked with looking not for the compound itself, but for the patterns of life that emanated from it, the supply convoys, the radio signals, the faint heat signatures of its generators. This external pressure began to manifest as physical decay within the fortress. A persistent leak, fed by the relentless humidity, stained a wall in a subterranean corridor, a dark map spreading across the concrete that no amount of patching could stop. A generator, once perfectly maintained, began to sputter intermittently, causing the lights in the command center to flicker for a fraction of a second, a momentary lapse in the compound's absolute control over its environment. The jungle, which had been held at bay by a perimeter of scorched earth and constant labor, began to test the boundaries with a renewed vigor. A single vine, thicker than a man's wrist, found a purchase on a watchtower, its green tendrils a slow, silent assault on the structure's integrity. These were small failures, insignificant on their own, but together they formed a narrative of entropy. The perfectly sealed world was becoming porous. The first true breach was not made by a SEAL team, but by a human voice. In a sterile interrogation room hundreds of miles away, a captured Zeta accountant, a man who had never set foot in the fortress but who managed the fuel shipments that powered its generators, finally broke. His confession was not a grand betrayal, but a trickle of logistical data. Dates, routes, names of suppliers. It was a single thread, seemingly inconsequential, but in the hands of CIMAR's analysts, it was enough to begin unraveling the fabric of the invisible empire. This information multiplied. Each captured operative provided another piece of the puzzle, revealing the network of safe houses, communication nodes, and money laundering fronts that supported the hidden capital. The fortress remained untouched, but its supply lines, the arteries that fed the beast, were being systematically severed. The kingdom was being isolated not by walls, but by a spreading desert of compromised assets. The psychological effect on Lazcano was profound. The fortress, once his ultimate expression of power and control, began to feel like a cage of his own making. The constant hum of the air recyclers in the bunker, once the sound of security, now sounded like the breathing of a tomb. The paranoia that had driven him to build this sanctuary now whispered that it had become his most predictable location, a fixed target on an increasingly hostile map. He became obsessed with the surveillance systems, spending hours watching the feeds from the perimeter cameras, scrutinizing the movements of his own guards. The absolute trust he had once placed in his military system was eroding, replaced by the suspicion that the enemy was no longer just outside the gates, but potentially walking the corridors beside him. The watchers were being watched, and the master of the panopticon was becoming its most anxious prisoner. The impulse to leave, to move, to break the sterile routine of the compound began to grow. For years his power had been magnified by his absence from the world. Now that same absence felt like an atrophy, a disconnection from the territories he claimed to command. He felt the need to see the world not as a series of data points on a screen, but as a physical space to be touched and dominated, a desire to escape the suffocating perfection of his own creation. The first tangible result of the new intelligence was a raid, executed with surgical precision, on a Zeta communications hub in an anonymous suburban house in Coahuila. CMAR teams descended from helicopters in the dead of night, neutralizing the guards and seizing encrypted hard drives before any alarm could be raised. It was a silent, bloodless operation that sent a shockwave through the Zeta command structure. The state was no longer just fighting them, it was hunting them. News of the raid reached the jungle bunker not as a loud explosion, but as a sudden, deafening silence on a secure channel. A vital node in the network had simply vanished. For Lazcano, it was the ultimate violation. The enemy had demonstrated an intimate knowledge of his operations, a level of insight that could only come from a deep internal breach. The fortress could protect his body, but it could no longer protect his secrets. The atmosphere inside the compound soured. The disciplined silence of the guards was now tinged with suspicion. Every conversation was clipped. Every glance held a potential accusation. The shared ideology of ruthless efficiency was being corroded by a more primal instinct, self-preservation. The foundation of the empire, absolute loyalty enforced by absolute fear, was beginning to crack under the weight of a greater fear, the fear of an omniscient, implacable enemy. The tigers in their cages seemed to sense the shift. Their pacing grew more agitated, their nocturnal roars taking on a desperate, frustrated quality. They were predators, trapped in a space that was no longer secure, their instincts telling them that the delicate balance of their small world had been disturbed. Their gilded cage was beginning to feel as much like a trap to them as the fortress was to their master. It was in this climate of mounting pressure and internal decay that Lazcano made a fateful decision. He needed to reassert control, not just over his organization, but over his own sense of agency. He needed to break the pattern, to prove to his enemies, and perhaps to himself, that he was not a prisoner of his own design. He resolved to leave the sanctuary, to step back into the world of chance and risk. This decision was not born of strategic necessity, but of a deeply human impulse, a claustrophobic need for open air. He chose a destination far from the jungle, a place of mundane normalcy, a small town where he could blend in, a place where no one would expect to find the ghost leader of the world's most feared cartel. He would watch a baseball game. As the helicopter prepared for departure on the concrete pad, the fortress seemed to hold its breath. The massive, brutalist structure, built to withstand a military invasion, was being undone by a simple desire to escape its confines. For the first time in a long time, the king was leaving his castle unguarded. The lifting of the helicopter was a symbolic act of severance. As it rose above the canopy, the compound shrank below, a concrete scar in an ocean of green. The machine built to project power was being left behind, its purpose temporarily suspended. The greatest crack in the fortress was the empty space its creator had just left in the sky, a vacuum into which the forces of the outside world would inevitably rush. The death of the king does not mean the immediate collapse of the kingdom. With Heriberto Lazcano's body vanished and his legend ascending into myth, his jungle fortress remained a secret, a heart still beating within a dead empire. It lay dormant in the wilderness, a fully armed and operational ghost ship whose captain had been lost at sea. The Mexican state knew that killing the man was not enough. The infrastructure of his terror had to be located, understood, and systematically erased from the earth. With the ghost of its creator exorcised in a dusty provincial town, the hunt shifted from the man to the monuments he left behind. The special forces of the Mexican Navy, CMAR, repurposed their vast intelligence network. They were no longer tracking a phantom moving between safe houses, but searching for a fixed point, a geographical anchor for a transnational criminal enterprise. They began to hunt for the architecture of power itself. The key was not found in a dramatic deathbed confession, but in the cold, silent language of data. Encrypted hard drives seized months earlier in a raid on a Zeta communications outpost finally yielded their secrets to a team of cryptographers. Amidst terabytes of noise, a pattern emerged: fragmented logistical manifests, coded references to fuel shipments for a high-consumption off-grid location, and partial satellite phone pings that triangulated to a void on the map. Tasked with this new set of coordinates, intelligence analysts directed orbital satellites to stare into the green emptiness where San Luis Potosí and Veracruz bleed into one another. For weeks, the images showed nothing but an unbroken canopy. Then, an analyst using thermal imaging detected it, a faint geometric heat signature, an unnatural warmth that betrayed the presence of generators and human activity deep beneath the jungle's insulating blanket. The invisible kingdom had been found. The mission that was planned was not an assault, but a post-mortem examination. The target was believed to be largely abandoned, its command structure decapitated. The objective was not to engage an enemy, but to perform an autopsy on an empire, to recover its records, understand its systems, and seize the physical evidence of its crimes before it could be scrubbed by Lazcano's successors. At first light, the silence of the jungle was not broken, but compressed by the rhythmic thud of rotor blades. A flight of Mexican Navy Blackhawks flying low and fast materialized out of the morning mist. They did not land on the exposed helipad. Instead, they hovered over the central courtyard as elite Marines descended on fast ropes, their black forms sliding silently into the heart of the dead beast. The fortress that had been designed to repel a small army offered no resistance. The electrified fences were inert, their power source long since exhausted or shut down. The camouflaged machine gun nests were filled with rotting leaves, and the watchtowers stood like skeletal sentinels over a forgotten ruin. The only sounds were the wind whistling through the empty cages and the crunch of tactical boots on a gravel path no longer maintained. Inside the main building, the air was stale, thick with the smell of mold and trapped humidity. The Marines moved with tactical precision through spaces built for paranoia, their modern weapons and night vision goggles a stark contrast to the decaying brutalist concrete. They were soldiers of an established state walking through the tomb of a man who had tried to build his own. The first violation of the sanctum was surgical and quiet. In the subterranean command center, the Empire's brain was systematically disconnected from its dead body. Teams of technicians bagged servers, removed hard drives, and carefully dismantled the sophisticated satellite arrays, preserving every circuit board and memory chip as evidence. The room that had projected fear across a continent was being rendered mute. The search then turned inward, for the secrets built into the very bones of the structure. Engineers with ground-penetrating radar and sonic scanners began to read the concrete, mapping the fortress's hidden anatomy. They were hunting for the voids, the hollow spaces where the true nature of this kingdom had been concealed. The first discovery was made with a controlled detonation that echoed dully through the subterranean levels. Behind a seamless section of a corridor wall, revealed by the dust and debris, lay not a treasure room, but a sterile, soundproofed chamber. It contained nothing but a single steel chair bolted to the floor and a dark stain around a central drain, a silent confession written in absence. Even the hidden sanctum of black marble was violated. What had been a stage for absolute power became just another room in a sprawling crime scene. Forensic teams dusted the heavy leather chairs for fingerprints and pried at the exotic wood panels, searching for the listening devices that Lazcano had undoubtedly installed to spy on his own lieutenants. The paranoia that built the room was now being used to deconstruct it. A heavy steel safe, concealed behind a painting of a prowling tiger, yielded the Empire's most potent weapon, its bookkeeping. The blast from the shaped charge tore the door from its hinges, revealing not stacks of cash or jewels, but meticulously organized ledgers. They were filled with columns of names, dates, and figures, the detailed accounting of a protection racket that reached into the highest levels of politics and business. Every object was stripped of its symbolic power and reduced to an exhibit number. The custom furniture was photographed and dismantled. The floors were scanned, then sectioned and pulled up. The fortress was being flayed, its layers of authority peeled back to expose the raw, functional horror of its purpose. It was being turned inside out for the world to see. The most profound silence was found at the massive steel cages. They stood open and rusted, their floors overgrown with weeds. Forensic teams in white suits knelt in the dirt, sifting the soil for bone fragments, for any physical proof to substantiate the horrifying rumors. But they found nothing. The complete and total absence of any remains was in itself the most damning evidence of all. The operation lasted for weeks, a methodical and relentless occupation. The compound ceased to be architecture and became pure data, a sprawling matrix of ballistic reports, DNA swabs, financial records, and structural blueprints. It was no longer a fortress or a hideout. It was a crime scene of unprecedented scale, and its testimony was being recorded in thousands of evidence bags. Once the fortress had surrendered all its secrets, a final verdict was passed by the state. It could not be allowed to stand, not even as a ruin. It was too potent a symbol, a potential pilgrimage site for a new generation of criminals, a concrete shrine to a philosophy of terror. It had to be not just defeated, but erased from the landscape. Engineers from the Mexican army moved in, their work precise and final. They drilled into the load-bearing columns and concrete foundations, packing them with high explosives. The structure built to defy the world, a monument to permanence and paranoia, was now wired for its own demolition, waiting for a single electronic pulse to end its story and return its components to dust. So where does power truly reside, in concrete, or in what survives its fall? Subscribe to continue this journey into the architecture of ambition and ruin, and reflect on the silent stories that buildings tell long after their masters are gone. The moment of judgment for the fortress was not delivered by a rival army, but by the cold, precise calculations of state engineers. They moved through the silent corridors, not as conquerors, but as demolition experts, their work a final, bureaucratic act of erasure. High explosives were packed into the load-bearing columns and deep into the concrete foundations, turning the monument to paranoia into a vessel for its own annihilation. The structure built to withstand the world was now wired to consume itself from within. The detonation was a single concussive roar that ripped through the jungle's deep hum, a man-made thunderclap that sent birds scattering for miles. For a brief moment, the brutalist form hung in the air, then succumbed to gravity, collapsing inward in a churning cloud of grey dust and pulverized concrete. The sound that followed was not one of victory, but a deep, resonant sigh as the earth settled. The unnatural weight lifted from its surface, leaving behind only a plume of smoke rising through the canopy. Today, the site is a wound in the process of healing. The jungle, patient and relentless, has begun its work of reclamation. What the explosives shattered, the roots now pry apart and the relentless humidity corrodes. Twisted lengths of oxidized rebar curl from the earth, like the ribs of a long-dead leviathan. A thick carpet of green has grown over the rubble, softening the sharp edges of the destruction, slowly digesting the last evidence of the kingdom that was carved into this remote wilderness. Officially, the place once again does not exist. It has been scrubbed from maps and its access routes allowed to be swallowed by the undergrowth. Yet its ghost remains, a subtle wrongness in the landscape. From the cold altitude of a satellite, one can still discern the faint, geometric outline of its foundation, a scar that the jungle has not yet fully concealed. It is an absence that carries more weight than the structure ever did, a void defined by the violence of its creation and the equal violence of its end. Of the entire compound, only fragments of the steel cages proved indigestible. Thrown clear by the blast, their bars bent and blackened, they lie half-buried in the soft earth, like the relics of a forgotten and terrible religion. The wind, no longer carrying the scent of predators, moves through their twisted frames with a low, mournful whistle. They are profoundly, finally empty, their purpose extinguished, standing now as the ultimate symbol of a power that caged not only its victims, but its own master, before rusting into irrelevance. Heriberto Lazcano, the architect of this fear, met his end not in his fortress, but in the glaring, ordinary sunlight of a provincial town. His death was a mundane firefight, a footnote of violence far from the epicenter of his power. Yet in a final act of myth-making, his body was stolen, spirited away by his own men. He was denied a grave, allowing him to achieve in death the ghost-like status he cultivated in life, a legend without a body, an evil without a final resting place. The empire he built with military precision did not survive him. Without its cold, unifying center of gravity, Los Zetas fractured, shattering into a constellation of warring factions. The disciplined paramilitary force devolved into a more chaotic and desperate form of violence, a plague of terror that continues to metastasize across the territories he once controlled. His legacy was not an enduring kingdom, but the enduring chaos that followed its collapse. The secrets of the fortress were buried with its rubble. While ledgers and hard drives could map the financial architecture of the empire, they could never account for the human cost. The sterile, soundproofed rooms and the soil beneath the cages hold stories that were never recorded. The fates of countless individuals erased so completely that not even a bone fragment remains to testify. The perfect crime of the fortress was its ability to turn human beings into pure absence. In its final analysis, the compound was not an instrument of power, but a symptom of its disease. It was the architectural manifestation of a mind that saw the world as an irredeemable threat, a paranoia so absolute it required the creation of a separate reality. The fortress built to project strength across a continent was, in truth, a sarcophagus built to contain the profound weakness of a man who could not live in the world he had conquered. The jungle remains indifferent. The ancient saber trees that once provided camouflage for sniper towers now cast their shadows over a field of debris, their roots slowly grinding concrete back into sand. The drone of insects has returned, a constant high-frequency hum that has replaced the thrum of generators and the echoes of encrypted commands. Nature has absorbed the aberration, its slow biological processes, the final rebuttal to the brutalist ambition of a single human will. Perhaps what we build says less about the power we command than about our terror of being erased. The fortress was a desperate, concrete argument against oblivion, a monument constructed to deny the fundamental impermanence of a life built on violence. It was a king's futile attempt to carve his name into the earth, only to have the jungle quietly, patiently, and completely swallow it whole. In the dense, forgotten folds of the Mexican jungle, there is a place that truly does not exist. Its memory survives only as a classified file, a whisper in the underworld, and a scar on the land that is slowly fading from view. It is a testament not to the strength of an empire, but to the silence that inevitably follows its fall. If stories like this make you see power from a different angle, subscribe to follow other downfalls as astonishing as this one.